Hey everyone, welcome back. So in this video, we're going to cover a moderately large topic, and that's going to be involving Scene2D UI widgets. Now, widgets can be anything from text buttons or labels on the screen, or progress bars, checkboxes, radio buttons, anything like that. There's a lot of things you can do with this, and it's essentially your entire UI will most likely be wrapped around this if you want any kind of interactivity or anything without having to manually code it, because there are a lot of things pre-built for you, such as text buttons and whatnot, that are really nice to use, and you can skin them however you want. Uh, and as I just mentioned there, the word skin, that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today, is um, getting a skin setup, which is essentially the visual backbone of Scene2D UI widgets. Um, It'll determine how they look, how they function when they've been clicked, or visually, not necessarily the interactive uh, outcome of clicking something, but it gives you a lot of control over how your UI elements will visually feel and represent themselves, and what kind of fonts they're using and whatnot. And so just to kind of get started, if you remember where we left off, we have our loading screen, our splash screen, and this empty main menu screen, and we created this new font using a free type font generator, which allows us to load up true type fonts, which are very nice. There's a lot of free ones out there. You can feel free to use any ones you want. But just to continue on, in our main menu screen, if you remember, we have like essentially nothing. It's the pretty empty generic screen. We're going to introduce something alongside our stage called the skin. And that is from the Scene2D UI skin path. And so to kind of get it started, you just initialize it as you would any other Java object, equals a new skin. Now, there are two constructors you can, or will most likely use throughout the lifetime of setting up your Scene2D skin stuff. So there's this empty constructor where you don't pass in any arguments or anything, but then there's also the GDX files internal. And what that does is it takes a JSON file, as you see here, and it'll load it up, and in the JSON file we have here, you'll notice there's a lot of, oh gosh, I wish I could get rid of all these errors, but you'll notice that there's these chunks here, and you'll also notice that there's the com, bad logic, DX, scene. These are essentially like package directory locations, and button style. So button style is essentially like a button object, text button you'll see here, scroll pane, progress bar, select box, that kind of deal. So you can kind of see just from looking at this how each of these chunks are widgets that we're setting the style settings to, and by using what's in this JSON file, we go back here, and when you load that JSON file, it'll incorporate all the chunks of theme, like skin settings that we have in here, and use them anytime we use these objects. So like if we use a button, it'll use whatever we set for the default and toggle and whatnot. And it'll set what it looks like and what it looks like when it's been pressed, as you see here, like checked or up. Down is normally when it's been pressed down, and up is normally when it's just left untouched for a button. So just that kind of idea, where if you don't have one of these set up, Scene2D won't know what it looks like, and it won't be able to be skinned, so your stage won't know how to skin it. Or rather, the Scene2D won't know how to skin it, and so it won't have any way to visually represent it on screen, and I believe it normally ends up in an error when you're missing an element in your JSON text. Now, for those of you who don't know what JSON is, it's pretty much just a data structure that's really easy to read for both humans and computers, actually. it's really nice to parse. There are a lot of good parsers out there, and LibGDX definitely has one that just kind of auto incorporates it, especially with the skin. It just auto parses all this for you when you load it up. Um, so as long as you have something to work with, I believe this is just the default one that LibGDX provides. I removed a whole bunch of extra stuff that we won't really be dealing with. In fact, we don't even need this scroll pane now that I think about it. We're most likely just going to stick to using the progress bar, maybe not even the select box to be honest, but we're going to be using text buttons for sure, and definitely a text label. So I might just move that down to make that a little bit easier to read real quick. Okay, there we go. So yeah, we have a label, a button, a text button, progress bar, and a select box. So those are just the 4 elements that I have themed out right here. And again, you can get this off the LibGDX wiki. It'll be a lot bigger. I'll probably post a link to it down in the description. That comes with the not only the JSON but the default UI. So you have something to work with, and you'll be able to change this out and everything as you want. It's really up to you, but this is just a good starting place. As you see, there are like button elements and drop-down menus and sliders and whatnot. That it's basically a frame, a default template for every single UI element that Scene2D allows in its UI widget. So that's just a general overview of what this JSON, this UI skin JSON file is for. And do know I've added it to my assets in my Android module under a UI folder. You can name that folder anything you want. You can put it anywhere you want. You just know you're going to be loading these 3 files in some way or another down the road. So I'll probably provide this one again in the description, but this is all you really need to work with. So if you're going to get the default one from the LibGDX wiki, you can remove all the stuff you don't want, or just leave it. Doesn't really matter. It'll load up either way. So to move a little bit forward, we also have this atlas file, and for those of you who are new to working with texture atlases, this is pretty simple to understand once you actually hear a little bit about it. So if you remember, we have this picture, and you'll notice how things are placed in a kind of formal way. They're placed in a very particular spacing and a special boxed up way. And there's a reason for that. That is so, one, you can maximize the amount of space that is taken up by these, or I'm sorry, minimize the amount of space that is taken up by each of these textures. So you can shrink the file size of this so it's efficient, and so you want to load each texture one by one. That's why texture atlases really improve the performance of your computer, because it'll take up, or of your game, because it'll take up less resource usage by only having to keep in memory one texture file, and then it just collects parts that it needs for certain textures to load on screen. And that brings me back to this atlas file. So you can have this file, but if you want to use each element in a special way rather than just one huge picture, you have to have an atlas. And what the atlas is technically like a dictionary of what each image is in here. It's a breakdown of this entire texture image. Just to kind of go through it, you'll see the basic kind of like this language that it has. It's basically like a name, and then you have a bunch of properties about this name. And to start, you have the file name, the size of the atlas image, the color format, and the filtering style, the mip-map filtering. And normally I set this to nearest because when you're dealing with pixel art, you want nearest instead of linear. So it's easy enough to come in here and change those from linear to nearest on both. I normally recommend that just to have sharper images. Otherwise it does linear filtering and it tries to smooth out edges of pixel art, and it normally doesn't look so good when it's scaled up. The nearest normally helps for scaling those images to larger sizes without losing your quality. So we can ignore the repeat because we don't have any repeating images that we want to check off and whatnot. So where's a good one we can actually pin down? I believe, so yeah, the slider knob, X, Y, yeah, I think this is a good example. So we have this rotate, which this image hasn't been rotated. It's talking about this slider knob, this little down arrow looking anchor piece at the top left here. And as you can see, it's normally oriented like this. You slide it left and right on a sliding bar to indicate like whether you want more of something or less of something, such as like a volume slider. And it's located at 1, 1. You'll see there's a little bit of space there. If it'll let me zoom in, there we go. So you'll notice there's 1 pixel spacing there, and that's why it has the X and Y, and it sets the 1, 1 there. And the size, it will determine like the width is 9 and the height is 18, and so it's basically showing or sectioning off this atlas image, and that's really all these settings are for. The offset's normally never set. The origin's normally the same thing as the size. So depending on how these are set up, like you won't ever really be making these yourself. There are a lot of programs out there, such as texture packers and whatnot, that will create these atlas files for you. And they don't necessarily have to be named atlas. They just have to have the format of, as you see here, how these look. So with that, I'm pretty sure that's a pretty long overview of just some of these smaller attributes of this setting up a skin, but it's definitely necessary to understand what you're using. And so I hope that kind of helps in breaking down and being able to read some of this stuff and understand what's going on here. It's just splitting this up, and what it can actually do is with all these names, it can give each of these smaller textures within this larger texture. It can give them names. So like if this is if this is like, I don't know, button 1 and button theme 1 and button theme 2, you can have in here like this would say button theme 1 and this would say button theme 2, and you can load those textures by name. And so once we get further into other projects and stuff, you'll be able to understand why that can be useful, and why texture atlases really shine when creating a game. They're just really, really helpful. I recommend learning a lot about them as soon as possible before getting into a lot of rendering mumbo jumbo, a lot of that messy stuff. So, such as like animations, especially. So I'll stop rambling on here, and we can finally continue moving on. I'm going to keep this open just because there's a key point I want to make before moving into actually working with our skin. So first things first is because we're using a custom font, and we do have this JSON, normally there's a default font loaded in here, as that's what LibGDX provides. They provide this default widget font, and honestly it looks terrible when it scales and everything. Not that these will scale any better, but I don't personally like to use it. I want to use my own font, and so to do that you can just leave this set as default font. You'll notice there's like all these font attributes. Like if I select this here, it highlights font, font, font. And that sets the font to all these widgets to be whatever the skin labels as the default font. And to understand that, I'm going to show you guys how to load up our UI atlas real quick, because like I said, I don't want to use a default loader, because I did remove the default font, and it'll try to load a default font, but because I removed that out of our JSON file, That's going to cause issues, and I believe it will just crash and not be able to load because it is missing this and it doesn't know what default font attribute is. This is a name for something, not actually like a property like this is here. So um, to start, first we want to load our texture atlas, and then we'll load our font in. So we'll do this dot skin dot add regions and app.assets.get, and we'll actually have to go do this in our loading screen real quick in our queue assets, but for now we're just going to add this in. It's going to be UI and UI skin.atlas, and that's texture atlas.class. So as we've pulled things out of our asset manager before, you do the .get call, and you choose where that file came from, and that is in our assets UI, and it's right here, uiskin.atlas, and so that's what I have there. And that's going to be a class type atlas, or texture atlas, so that's the kind of object builder that we want to use with that. So like I said, we'll just got to go back to our loading screen real quick. We need to go to our queueAssets method, and we're going to want app.assets.load, and that's going to be the same thing, uiskin.atlas. That's going to be texture atlas.class. Okay, and so with that, our asset manager will load our UI skin, the texture at least, and then we'll be able to use it over here. So once you've done that, because like I said, we're using our own font, using that free type font, and we want those to be used on our buttons and stuff. With a skin, you can add as many like UI properties as you want that the skin will use to apply on your widgets. And that's kind of what we're doing here is we have this add regions and method, and you can send it to load, like it'll add more texture resources that it can use to skin some attributes, or I'm sorry, it can skin some widgets by, you can add as many as you want and it'll be able to work with all of them. And it uses, like I said in the atlas, it'll utilize all these name fields for each one, and you'll be able to pull them out on your own. So now that we got our atlas of all our images and stuff, we want to have our default font, or the font we loaded on our own, this font 24. So to do that, you just do this .skin.add. It's pretty much the same thing as the regions, except this one you're going to give a name. And this is where the default font thing will make a little bit more sense. So you have your default font, that's the name you want to give it, and then app.font24. So it's as easy as that. Now our skin is aware of the font, and we gave it the title default font, and that has to be strictly called default font, or in other words, anywhere that this is used. So this could even just say like font 24. But if we called it font 24, then this would also have to be called font 24. So I'm just calling it default font just to keep it easy, especially in our JSON file, because everywhere it says default font all over the place. So now that we've added the default font by hand, manually, to our skin, when we load this JSON file, it'll know what default font is, and so then it can use that resource and tie it to all these label theming styles, and be able to use it whenever we make a label or a text button and whatnot. So now that we've done the pre-configurations, we can finally load that JSON file. And to do that, it's as simple as saying this .skin.load and then gdx.files.internal uiskin.json. So if you remember, like I was going to call this just in the constructor here, that's basically what the skin will do when you have it in the constructor parameters. However, I'm doing it at a later step because, like I said, I don't have a default font set up in the JSON file because I'm using my own personal font. So that's just how you can kind of do it on your own, do things manually and whatnot. So you have to do all the pre-configurations of things that aren't in your JSON file, and then you can load your JSON file to use those elements that you just added on your own. So with that, I think I'm going to stop here before I jump into anything else. This video probably was a little bit more dense than some of the other ones, but now that we've done all these pre-configurations, we're able to load our skin and use our skin for any UI elements that we want once we get into our main menu screen. And we're going to start having buttons that will allow us to either play the game or exit the game, or even just change settings and whatnot. So with that, I hope you guys enjoyed this informative video. If you have any questions or any fixes you'd like to mention to me in case I slipped anywhere, please do mention them in the comments below, and like, comment, subscribe as usual. And other than that, thank you for watching.